Good morning and welcome to Practical Christian Lessons. I'm Joshua Pearsall, and today we are going over some archaeology. And by archaeology, I mean comparing the theology and culture and such of the Old Testament with that of the people around them to demonstrate that what is in the Old Testament is so utterly unique compared to what is around it that it can't have just been some evolution out of it, despite what some modern, very hyper-skeptical theories would put forth, even though no new evidence has come forward to support this, and the only thing that changed was their assumptions. About 80 years ago, the shift in scholarship happened. If you don't know what I'm talking about, watch some of our earlier videos. I believe in our introduction video to the series, we go over that exact thing. This essay is going to be on page 66. We've jumped forward a bit here. This is the Zondervan Archaeological Study Bible. Don't look for the archaeology. If you're looking for this, it's the archaeological, but it's also out of print, so it's going to be kind of pricey. There are a lot of great essays we're skipping over, so if you do, I think there's a digital form of this available somewhere, so if you are interested in archaeology, go look at those essays. There's a lot of really, really great essays in here, but a lot of them, at least for this series, we're not going to touch on because they're not relevant to what we're doing here. Maybe some other time. This essay is on Genesis 39, Joseph and Potiphar's wife, and you might be wondering how this is going to be relevant. I promise stick through this essay. It is a funny story. In an Egyptian text called Papyrus de Orbini, dating to approximately 1225 BC, contains a story titled The Two Brothers. Vividly illustrating the fantastic nature of ancient storytelling, this tale is a curious example of a non-biblical story having striking similarities to a biblical text. In this fictional account, Bata lived with and faithfully served his older brother, Anubis. One day, Anubis' wife tried to seduce Bata, who rejected her advances. Furious, she accused him of attempting rape, and the enraged Anubis prepared to kill Bata. But Bata, forewarned by a cow, fled in the nick of time. A lake filled with crocodiles magically appeared between the two brothers, cutting off Anubis' pursuit. Anubis returned home and proceeded to kill his wife. Meanwhile, Bata cut out his own heart and placed it high in a pine tree, an act rendering him nearly immortal. The gods fashioned a beautiful wife for Bata. An immoral woman, however, she entered Pharaoh's harem and divulged to the Egyptians that Bata could be killed by cutting down the pine tree. They followed through, but Anubis, apparently prepared to reconcile with Bata, found his brother's heart and restored him to life. Bata, in return, transformed him into a bull and carried Anubis to Pharaoh's court, where Bata's alarmed wife persuaded Pharaoh to sacrifice the bull. Its blood caused 2 trees to sprout. Realizing that Bata still lived, his wife arranged to have the trees cut down, but a splinter flew into her mouth and she became pregnant. She bore a son, whom Pharaoh raised as a crown prince. The boy Bata himself, in due course, became the pharaoh and appointed Anubis to be his viceroy. Outlandish as this tale may seem to us, many scholars have noted the amazing similarities between it and the biblical account of Joseph. Obvious parallels include a rivalry between brothers, a false accusation of rape, and an ascent to power in Egypt. There is no reason, however, to surmise that the biblical story may have been derived from this Egyptian tale. I'm just going to side note here really quick. That's another important facet of this story. Sorry, not the story, the series. One thing you hear a lot of people try to say online, especially when they're sort of born and raised in skepticism and don't look at the text themselves, they'll say of like Christianity or other religions, but mainly about Christianity, oh, it's just copying these other religions. It's just copying their tales. Here, of course, is an outlandish example. As it says, no one would seriously say this is going to be a copy, or that the tale of Joseph in Egypt is a copy of this, or phrase that. No one worth listening to is going to say that. Some people will point to things like the Greek tale of Dionysius and his resurrection and point to Christ. Read the two tales. There are some very striking differences between this. We'll actually probably get to that in this series. We might do a New Testament version, go over some of those myths. That's the sidebar. Back to this, and I'll bring up the next point. The bizarre quality of the Egyptian story contrasts strongly with the factual tone of the historical biblical narrative. At the same time, parallels between the stories may not have been accidental. If composed after the time of Joseph, the Egyptian tale may have been influenced by the biblical reality. If the Egyptian story existed prior to the time of Joseph, assuming that Papyrus Dior was not its earliest iteration, and then, of course, also debating the dates on Joseph and such. The obvious parallels included in the Joseph narrative may have been intended to signal the fact that the God of Israel could elevate a son of Israel to power, even in an Egyptian context. The argument could be made that the biblical account shows that Joseph fulfilled even the Egyptian ideal of a hero. It is impossible in the final analysis to speak definitively of literacy dependence going in either direction in this instance. There is simply not enough evidence to make an accurate judgment. For another parallel to the biblical story, see the tale of Apis' two sons on page 45, and that's another tale of two sons, going over a rivalry there. We're not going to be reading that for this one. And I bring this essay up for several points. One is it noted historical tones. Now, people will complain. This is not wanting to go back on there. I'll fix that in a minute. About the way in which biblical authors write their history. And they'll say there's contradictions. They'll say that they're clearly not using facts, yada, 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 yada. That often, at least on a pop level, and even in some scholarship, this comes from a misunderstanding of how our history works today versus the history of the past. One obvious example, and two of the four Gospels, I want to say it's Matthew and Luke, but it could be Matthew and John. One of them says Christ is given a purple garment. The other one says red or crimson, depending on how they want to translate it there. And they'll be like, that's a contradiction. Which point, of course, the first obvious point to that is that's pretty insignificant. It doesn't mean anything. But two, they're doing that for a purpose. Depending on how you take your dating of the authorship, it's clear that several of the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke especially, had a body of shared material. Now, of course, right, the apostles all traveled with Jesus, Mark being the disciple of Peter and writing Peter's memoirs, traveled and was influenced by the stories. They all heard the same stories. They shared the same tales. They all saw the same things. So, of course, even if they weren't sharing written material, which they probably were, but, we can't confirm that, they were absolutely sharing from the same source material. So, yes, there's going to be a lot of similarities and overlaps there. They're aware of that, and they intentionally have minor details like that, where we'd be like, that's not how history works. It is either red or it's purple. They might be changing that detail for a point, right? Purple is the color of royalty, and not just royalty, of Caesar, of the wealthy, of the elite, of the imperial. And I believe it's Matthew who says it's purple, right? This is lifting up as part of Matthew's gospel, showing Christ as king, as the real king, as the true king above all kings. There's a purpose behind the details. And this doesn't change the actual factual story and the history that's being told. And it wasn't just the biblical authors that did this. Pretty much every ancient historical writing does this. It's still on loan. I don't have it with me. But John Oswalt notes in his book, The Bible Among the Myths, how the closest things to histories in the ancient world were written in a specific style with a specific purpose to convey a specific point. And even the biblical history is far closer to what we describe as history now today. Because it is history. But as far as like how it's written, it's much closer to how we now write histories. Where we're very focused on exact facts, exact details. It happened at this time, in this way. They were wearing these specific things. Whereas for the biblical authors, John's a great example. John's clearly writing a history. He's also clearly not concerned with the chronology of his events. He moves things around, and he makes no effort in segueing between these events. If you try to figure out the chronology of John's gospel, just from John's gospel itself, you're going to have trouble because he's not always just like, and then this, and then this, and this. He just moves from story to story. And John's gospel's written last. That's kind of the understood thing. It's attested to in early history. So he's writing this aware that these other ones exist. It still irks me, though. John's gospel has always been the hardest one for me to work through because my brain tries to follow along things and he makes it difficult. That's a side tangent. But that's a perfect example of that. I forgot what my other point. No, that was my 3 points. Is clearly when people are like, oh, everything's just religion is just copying things. That's not true. Even when you're comparing Christianity and these pagan religions, those pagan religions are not just copying each other. There might be overlaps, there might be shared imagery. This is something that the biblical authors do all the time, is taking a shared imagery, as they said here, right? It may be being used to show Joseph as the ultimate hero, even in Egyptian ideals. That's part of how these texts were being written. They're not just conveying truth and history and fact, they're also conveying it in a specific polemical way. They're attacking the ideas and thoughts of these people around them and showing, hey, here's where truth is, here's where they get things wrong. Even by your standards, our people are these great heroes. Things like this. That's how the authors are writing these texts. And that makes it so fun and so interesting to engage and go through these things if you can. Time's a limited thing. I appreciate everyone who watches my videos. Thank you so much for doing so. And I understand it's hard to find time to go through those older source materials. Like, how many people are going to go read the actual two tales there? And you only have so much time in the day. You only have so much time in your life, and you have to devote it to certain things. But hopefully this series can be a fun way to sort of dig into those things without having to try and go through all those old source material. That's it. I'm just going to keep rambling if I keep going. So you guys have a wonderful week. God bless. If you missed our live stream this past Saturday, we went over some of the books I've read for seminary, or all the books I've read for seminary this year. I only had classes this semester. I skipped out in the first part of this year. And then other books I've been reading throughout this year, as much as I can get through, as I've got plans tomorrow. I'm recording this on Friday. So you guys have a wonderful day. God bless, and I'll see you next time.